Jesus freak here. And first thing I want to get into before I mention anything else is um, I've probably mentioned I probably come from a very different faith tradition than most of my viewership. Even though, most of my viewership is probably Christian, I'm Christian, but if you were to draw a line and put Catholicism on the left, the Church of Rome, and on the far right you had your 5-point tulip Calvinists, I'm going to guess that a lot of my viewership is probably near the far right, and I'm right in the middle. So this is going to affect some of the things I say here. Now, I've probably mentioned to some people that I generally don't use translations other than the King James in my videos or in my, any of my instructive work. I have at some point used my own work, and sometimes you see me using the TTT project here and there. But I don't make a habit of that these days. And the reason is that I've run into a number of people for whom using anything other than King James is going to be a stumbling block. And not only is this a stumbling block for Peter Rutland's followers, Gail Riplinger's followers, people who read chick tracts, Mormons and other aberrant forms of Christianity tend to rely on the King James Version. And honestly, I think, that there isn't any teaching in the Bible you can find in the King James you won't find in current translations. But because not using the King James can be a stumbling block, I make it a point to only use the King James unless I have a good reason to do otherwise. Another reason I tend to prefer to use the King James, despite my personal preference for other translations, is the cultural attachment. That, if we threw out the King James just because it's old or because it might not be the most ideal translation sometimes, you're losing a lot of stuff that's, inherent to our culture. And a lot of our expressions and stuff, they no longer make sense without that point of reference. Another reason has to do with, I've said this, there's basically three people who've given us a modern language. William Caxton, William Tyndale, and William Shakespeare. And Tyndale is most well known to us because a lot of the King James Bible derives from Tyndale's work. And, this is kind of the foundation of our language as we know it today. And being that I come from an Anglican tradition, this was the consummate translation of the Anglican Church. And as such, this in the Book of Common Prayer especially mean a lot to people who come from that tradition. We don't Methodists don't use the Book of Common Prayer anymore, but it does have a heavy influence on what they do use. And so, it's kind of a bridge to the past, so to speak, and, unites us with our predecessors, I guess. And, well up into the 50s, you had other translations, but this was basically the gold standard. And, you find any good family Bibles, study helps, or whatever, most of them are going to be keyed to the King James. And the King James is pretty much, there are changes. There's a few minor revisions, a few differences between the original text and that of 1769. There's not a lot. I've actually done some comparisons. It's not really much of a difference. I have on one of my websites, kjv.volcanobible.org. This is an alternative recension of the King James. It's not the same text that you'll find in your printed Bibles, but it's about 99% the same. And you can kind of see the differences here and there because I edited it differently. And F.H.A. Scrivener did something similar in 1873 with the Cambridge Paragraph Bible. A lot of, Ruckmanites don't like the Cambridge Paragraph Bible because it deviates too much from what they're used to. I'm fine with it. I like the Cambridge Paragraph Bible. I believe it's what we call Editio Critica, critical edition of the King James Version. And I believe its text is closer to the original, and in many respects superior to the standard text, whether it be the standard text of Oxford or the standard text of Cambridge. This is the Cambridge Bible I'm holding. And my opinion regarding using the modern translations is, I'm fine with them. I use them frequently. I've got a number of translations here. I got the ICB. I got the RSV. I got several of those. I got the NRSV. I got the NIV, NASB. I got tons of translations. If I were going to, if I were going to pastor a church or something, I'd be reading out of the King James. I'd probably base my sermons off something else. I'd have my morning lessons out of the King James. I don't think the these and nows are that much of a problem once you understand them. And obviously you're going to have to get by the issue of the semantic drift, but it's really not that alien. It's not Middle English and Old English. I mean, you tried to read the English of Chaucer or the English of Beowulf, they have almost nothing to do with English of today. You'd have a real hard time. But, you know, even Tyndale's English is pretty close to our modern English. And like I said, you know, I've had problems with evangelizing people, and, you know, if they're not going to accept a version that I have, the King James is the lowest common denominator. I can use it with just about anyone. The other thing is that I have a different theory about the development of the New Testament text that's very much at odds with Westcott and Hort or Nestle and Lalande. And even somewhat at odds, I guess, with Hodges and Farstad or Robinson and Pierpont. That I tend to think that in the majority of cases, the longer reading was the original. And most of the time, the King James follows that. There's a couple places I disagree with the King James readings. That's pretty rare. But, yeah, and, you know, if I were going to stock a church or whatever, or if I were, you know, picking up a whole bunch of outreach Bibles or whatever, instead of paying a ton of money to some corporation who's holding the rights to some translation, I mean, outside of the UK, where, you know, Cambridge University Press controls the rights for England and Wales, and there's a board that controls the rights in Scotland, and they contract out to R.L. Allen, but in the rest of the world, the text is public domain. So you sometimes find Bibles for like $1 or so. They're going to be King James. And most of your nonprofit ministries that publish Bibles, they're publishing King James, although honestly, I don't agree with their reason for using the King James. And if I could do it myself, I'd probably print the ASV and Darby alongside them. But I would use this as my default. And if there were a problem with it, I'd probably switch to something like the New King James to have a more modern translation. But my go-to would be this. And like I said, don't mistake me for a Ruckmanite or a Riplingerite just because most of my videos feature me reading out of the King James, specifically, as opposed to some other translation. It's a matter of practicality. Pragmatism, not dogmatism. Dogma doesn't even enter into it for me. And I know, you know, there's people whose videos I watch that are King James only or are King James preferred for dogmatic reasons. I'm fine with that. That's what they believe. That's what they believe. I don't personally believe it, but I'm not going to break fellowship over that. I mean, we're all out there for the same reason. Or should be. We're all one in mission. We're trying to save the world. We're trying to bring the world to Jesus. And I mean, I'll use the best tool for the job. If I think that something else is going to work better, like LBLA Spanish Bible. If I'm working with people who are more likely to know Spanish, I mean, no hablo bueno, español, solo inglés, but if I had to use a Spanish Bible, I got 4 translations, and I'd probably use this one. This happens to be closer to the NASB, although it has a few verses that the NASB doesn't. But, you use what you feel is the best tool for the job. I think in English that tool's the King James. But that's just my opinion. Jesus freak out.